Hello, I'm Joel Shaddles, and I fought in World War II. I was in Europe during the war. I thought you might like to see some of the insignia and medals that I received for my service there. The one that probably would interest you the most is the one in the middle, and it's called the Purple Heart. To receive the Purple Heart, you have to, number one, be in combat, and number two, you have to be wounded by the enemy. The Purple Heart was actually thought of by General George Washington immediately after the Revolutionary War. It was the only medal that the United States had at that time. In 1932, Congress decided that the Purple Heart would be reserved for those people who were wounded during a war, and as I say, they bled for their country and were wounded by the enemy. The others are just insignias. They denote various and sundry things, but they're outlined for you so you can see them. So at this time we'll pass these around. I always like to start, rather than just jump into World War II, because after all I'm talking to students, and I'd like for you to know the favorite thing that I did in school, all through school, was read. I love to read. I feel that reading is so very important, and not only that, it's so much fun. I have talked at times about some of my favorite authors, one being Michener, James Michener, who has written any number of books. One in particular I think you would really enjoy. A lot of people have told me that they don't care for Michener because it's so difficult to get caught up in the story. And that's true. When you read Michener, you start off getting a history lesson or a lesson in geology. For instance, one of his best books, and it's got to be one of the finest books ever written, I think, is his book Hawaii. But to get started in Hawaii, how can you say that a book is not interesting? When you look on page 3, and he has talked about the coral reefs that grow up out of the Pacific Ocean. There's no islands there. Hawaii's not there. But over a period of millions of years, atolls grow from coral. And then finally, at some time back, way back in history, a bird flew over out into the Pacific Ocean, and he dropped his poop on an atoll. And from that poop there was a tiny seed from some kind of tree, and the tree grew, and that attracted more birds, and they dropped poop, and the next thing you know, here you've got an island called Hawaii, one of the beautifulest spots in the world today is Hawaii. So I don't see how you cannot appreciate a book like that, or his book on Alaska, where it starts off about 1 billion years ago. Now just imagine that, about 1 billion years ago. And he goes on to tell you how back in those days there was no ocean between Russia and the United States, what is to become the United States. It's land across there, and these people crossed the land, and the prehistoric animals, they crossed that land, and they got from one part of the world to a new part of the world, Alaska. And then it just takes off from there, and it brings you on down to the gold rush, and it gets you caught up and you're digging for gold. And then it takes you, you're catching salmon, and you're watching the salmon as they go back to where they were born, and how they do. And it's just a tremendous book. So I like to encourage everybody to read. But now we're going to talk about World War II. You might or might not know that we got into World War II when the Japanese, for some reason or another, bombed Hawaii. They bombed Pearl Harbor. And the day after that Sunday, December the 7th, our President Franklin D. Roosevelt mentioned that day that will live in infamy. Immediately after we declared war on Japan, Germany declared war on us. Of course, that war had already been going on. So now we're in a war. World War II actually started, believe it or not, on my birthday, September the 1st, 1939. That was on a Sunday, and I was out on the golf course, but I wasn't playing golf. I was caddying to get money. I needed the money in order to get a typewriter so I could be a better typist when I went to high school. But that's neither here nor there. But that was the war. But it's important because when I finished high school in 1942, I knew that I would be going off to war. There was no doubt about it, because that's what happened back in those days. There was a draft going on. They didn't draft girls. This war was not for females, although shortly after they began to admitting girls who would enlist in the WWII, which was the Women's Air Corps, Army Corps, the WAAF, the Women's Air Force, and things like that. But they enlisted of their own volition. They were not drafted. Boys were drafted, and I knew I was going to be drafted. So when I got out, I went to work for the Signal Corps at Fort McPherson, Georgia, working in the mailroom. Really, I guess I wanted to learn what I could about the Army before I went into the Army. And then I was told that when you're drafted, when you're called up for active duty, you just tell them that you work for the Signal Corps, and they'll swear you in as a soldier and send you right back here, and you'll be doing what you had been doing, but you'll be doing it in a uniform, and you'll be in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Didn't happen that way. What happened was, I got married, and in March of 1943, I was called up for active duty in the service. I reported at Fort McPherson, Georgia, and I recall when I was being in, before that though, the colonel had told me that I would be what I would be having to do, but they would just send me right on back. So I knew what to expect, but what I did not expect was when I was interviewed, and the man, I told him about my colonel and he should call the colonel, and he said, no, we won't do that. We don't need any more signal people. What I'm looking for today are good horsemen. I need men that can really ride a horse. And I explained to him I'd never been on a horse. And he said, you never been on a horse? I said, no, sir. And then I recalled, I said, well, actually, one time when I was about 5 or 6 years old, my daddy took me to Grant Park, and they put me on a pony. My daddy held the reins, and they walked me around a little ring. And that was been my total experience. He said, I knew you looked like a horseman. You're in the cavalry. Well, I found out later that everybody that went in that day was in the cavalry. That's who they were looking for, cavalrymen. And I was sent to Fort Riley, Kansas for basic training. While I was at Fort Riley, Kansas, my wife and I, she had our first son. I received an emergency furlough to come home. The doctors didn't think she would live. I got to see my son. She did live. She was turned out to be in good shape. And I saw him for 2 or 3 days before I had to go back to basic training. After basic training, I went to Louisiana Maneuvers, and there I joined the 15th Cavalry Regiment Mechanized. And we chased around the western part of Louisiana for 2 or 3 or 4 months. And then we were told that we would be getting a furlough and we could go home for a week at least before we went somewhere else. But instead we were called into the theater at the camp there, and our colonel, Colonel John B. Ribot, came out, and on the marquee of the theater it had 7 days leave starring Victor Mature. And the colonel comes out, and his exact words were, "Men, I am not Victor Mature. I am Colonel John B. Ribot. And there will be no 7 days leave. Instead, we're leaving here, and we're going to California for desert maneuvers. And on desert maneuvers, the strong will become stronger, and the weak shall perish, and I hope they do." That was my introduction to Colonel John B. Ribot.